prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. Of course, we have a tragedy in New Zealand. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next hour, but I did want to at least mention, in case you have not seen the news, 49 dead at a mass shooting at a mosque full of worshipers. One man was arrested. 2 other armed suspects are held in custody. It seems like it is really motivated by kind of a white supremacism, but necessarily it's important to read a little bit of the manifesto, where at least the individual who wrote the manifesto doesn't seem to like Donald Trump, but seems to have picked up on all sorts of other ideas. I don't think it's really even that worthwhile to try to understand all the motives when somebody is that deranged to go and kill people. That's reason enough. And I, being so naive, just simply said that we might spend some time talking about how even in a place like New Zealand, that would be a little bit surprising. I have friends that have said that if this country goes south, they may just all head to New Zealand. I've got one friend that actually goes and spends time there every year to actually gain residency. And I just was going to say to them next time I see him, well, even things like this can happen in New Zealand. Didn't occur to me that anybody would use this to justify attacks on the National Rifle Association, which are not even in New Zealand, attacks on Donald Trump. But I guess I just a little too naive about all this. We have Lathan Watts and Keisha Russel in studio. And Lathan, it didn't take long. Start looking at all these Twitter tweets, and we see all sorts of individuals in this country being blamed for what some deranged person in New Zealand is doing.
Yeah, that's really a sad commentary on our culture that, you know, within minutes or hours of something as tragic as this happening, regardless of where it happens in the world, the politicization of it starts almost immediately. And I mean, the news reports were still coming in when people were already starting to comment on it and try to draw some correlation between what happened there and whether it's gun control here or the president or whatever it may be. Can we not just, for a little bit, just absorb what happened and express some sympathy to the families of people that died and the people that are impacted by a tragedy before we start analyzing the politics of something? And just like you said, I mean, I don't know why we even read the manifesto of people who do this sort of thing. But when they do, it's interesting that he went out of his way to sort of distance himself from our president, and there were still people on CNN last night somehow trying to point the finger at our president for this, or at the NRA, who, as you rightly noted, have no presence in New Zealand. But you know, here we are. I guess that's media and political culture in America today.
Let me just mention Lathan Watts and Keisha Russel, both with First Liberty, and again, Associate Counsel. And Keisha, any thoughts about this before we move on to some other topics?
Yeah, I think what's alarming to me is that whenever anything like this happens, it always becomes some sort of political discussion, when in the end, the person who commits these crimes, they're the ones responsible for what happens. They're responsible for their own actions. They're responsible for controlling their own emotions and dealing with them, in a way that is, healthy and not criminal. I don't think you can blame anyone else but the person who pulls the trigger for the situation. And
again, we yesterday had Joel Rosenberg sitting in that chair there, and we were talking about anti-Semitism. And really, if you want to talk about hate crimes, I've looked at those numbers for the FBI just in this country, and hate crimes, if you use the FBI numbers, are either staying steady or even declining slightly, except for one category, and that's anti-Semitic actions. Almost a majority, and in many years, a majority are anti-Semitic. So there are times when Muslims have been attacked, and this one is probably the most horrific of all of them. But some of the greatest attacks around the world are by Muslims against Christians, and almost everyone seems like against Jews. So whether it's Jews, Christians, Muslims, or whether they're even attacking atheists, it's all a terrible loss of life. And back to what you said, Lathan, we just need to stop politicizing some of this. It's bad enough, but it doesn't help move anybody's agenda, and it makes everybody cynical, and it makes us afraid to even say that our thoughts and prayers go out because you get criticized for that now. Those tweets came out within minutes.
Exactly. And, anyone who criticizes someone for expressing sympathy and saying, I'm going to pray for you and your family, with some sort of reply about, that does nothing, or what good is that when X, Y, Z, fill in the blank.
Yeah.
These types of guns are still legal, or whatever it is. Clearly, has no concept of the power of prayer.
Yes. Well, again, just one of those topics I want to put on the table, and we will come back and maybe spend some more time with it a little bit later. But the first article is on New Zealand, but the original first article is one that Lathan wrote earlier in the week. What starts in South Carolina? And the reason I wanted to bring it up, whether you're from South Carolina or not, we'll come back to this a little bit later for our South Carolinians to hear that as well. The state legislature and even the flagship university there have a little bit of a debate as to whether or not to study the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Federalist Papers. And I look at the level of constitutional illiteracy, talking to two constitutional lawyers here, that is really appalling. Tell us more.
Well, this story sort of popped up last week, and I noticed it because there was also a recent poll done by Annenberg late last year where only 1/3 of the respondents could name the three branches of federal government, and another third couldn't name a single one.
Yes.
And so I see, that poll and then this fight in South Carolina going on as to whether or not you should even teach these things. And I know what the impact of constitutional illiteracy, the impact that it has on religious liberty, which is our mission.
Right.
And, the founders intended for the citizens themselves to be the first guardians of their liberty. And how can you defend your rights if you don't know what they are? And so South Carolina's legislature basically updated an older bill that was requiring this in light of the fact that the University of South Carolina was not really complying with it, and the university's president called it archaic. And so there's a little bit of a spat between the flagship university and the state legislature. And, being a history nerd, I know that fights that start in South Carolina sometimes have large implications for the country. So I thought it was a really good, really good microcosm for a larger problem in the country, which is why I decided to write about it. So I hope the legislature will stand their ground there and hold the university's feet to the fire.
Let me just mention, as we're going to a break, we'll come back a little bit more, that I wrote commentaries about this years ago, in which at one time John Whitehead, who is the head of the Rutherford Institute, was testifying in front of the Senate Judiciary that how rare it was for him to find that even one person out of hundreds could name all 5 First Amendment freedoms. And then I updated it because 5 years later, then there was a poll by the Annenberg Public Policy Center that found that 37%, this was a couple of years ago, couldn't name one of the 5. So we went from a time where most people could get 3 or 4, but maybe not 5, to a point where they couldn't name one of those: religion, press, speech, assembly, right to petition the government. That's pretty bad. Mm-hmm. So that shows how that has degraded just in the last decade when I've been writing these commentaries. So we'll come back and continue our conversation right here on Point of View.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In a previous set of commentaries, I talked about the interview Nick Pitts and I did with Jonathan Haidt on his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Then I saw an essay that quoted his earlier book, The Righteous Mind, where he talked about the conservative advantage. As a liberal, he wrote the book because he was convinced that American liberals do not get the morals and motives of their conservative countrymen. In one study he did with Jesse Graham and Brian Nozick, they tested how well liberals and conservatives could understand each other. They had the people fill out the Moral Foundations questionnaire. 1/3 of the time they were supposed to fill out the questions normally, answering as themselves. 1/3 of the time they were asked to fill out the questions as they think a typical liberal would respond. And 1/3 of the time they were supposed to fill out the questionnaire the way they believed a typical conservative would respond. The design of the research allowed the researchers to examine the stereotypes that each side had about the other. This also allowed them to see how accurate their answers were compared to people who were liberal and people who were conservative. They concluded that the results were clear and consistent. Moderates and conservatives were most accurate in their predictions, whether they were pretending to be liberals or conservatives. Liberals were the least accurate, especially those who described themselves as very liberal. I might add that this study was published 10 years ago. I think that it's even more likely that the gap in perception by liberals of conservatives has grown even more. Much of what Jonathan Haidt has written about in his recent books illustrates how millennial college students want even more protection from ideas they don't like. They're less likely than before to engage foreign ideas. And this is one example of why we have such polarization in the political arena. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Thinking Man Films, Patterns of Evidence, The Moses Controversy. Did Moses write the first books of the Bible? Patterns of Evidence in theaters March 14th, 16th, and 19th only.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about the importance of constitutional literacy, and of course you can imagine the reaction from two constitutional lawyers sitting across from me here, because indeed you would assume that the average person would have some understanding of the First Amendment. Freedom of speech, does that ring a bell? Freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. How about freedom of religion? Something we talk about so often here on the Friday program. And if nothing else, Keisha, I want to come to you for just a minute, because it does seem to me that we should at least expect some level of understanding of the structure of government, some understanding of the Constitution from individuals that are going to vote for individuals that are supposed to uphold the Constitution.
For sure. And I think that not only does it make you a more informed citizen, but it makes you a more productive citizen, someone who's able to have honest discourse about situations, even if you don't disagree with them, and be able to sort of balance the legal argument with what you think the practical argument is. And I think that's really what's missing in a lot of these social conversations we have today.
Well, and again, a lot of it, as you've alluded to, it's all about emotions. You know, how do I feel about that issue? Or I have an individual that's really good on a skateboard in a parking lot, so that's enough to elect him to Senate or to the presidency. Or I like the smile of that individual or something. This is not good for the future of the Republic, right?
Not at all. And like you said, you know, when we put so much emphasis on how we feel rather than what the law says, then we run into a lot of trouble.
Yes. Lathan, you also take on not only the fact that the average citizen doesn't seem to know some things about the Constitution, but in a previous commentary, and you got into it again in this column, you also point out that some United States senators don't seem to understand certain aspects of the Constitution.
Correct. I wish Annenberg would have polled the U.S. Senate on Article 6 of the Constitution and the strict prohibition against a religious test for office. Based on their questioning of recent nominees by Kamala Harris, Senator Hirono from Hawaii, Feinstein from California, Cory Booker from New Jersey. They clearly have either never read Article 6 or just don't care. But their
I think
line,
they don't care.
Yeah,
It's pretty. I mean, people have mentioned it several times.
right. The line of questioning they're taking on these nominees is absolutely blatantly unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm.
And we had another piece, I believe, by Kelly that suggested, for future nominees, if you get a question like this, your response should be very simple, polite, and humble. A pleading of the sixth article that, Senator, your question violates Article 6's prohibition on religious tests, and therefore I'm not going to answer it.
That's, I think, a very good way to go. You quote from Ronald Reagan. I grew up in California. My father ran for the California Assembly. I have a signature from then Governor Ronald Reagan. But one of the things he was fond of saying is not that our political opponents are ignorant. They just know so many things that aren't so. And you have that quote in there. And in some respects, people don't. It's not like they don't know. They just have the wrong facts in their heads, right?
Absolutely. And that's, in my opinion, even more dangerous than ignorance, is quote unquote knowing something that isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
And especially with regards to religious liberty, the kind of work that we do, this sort of assumption about the wall of separation between church and state, which is conspicuously absent from the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And we know what the founders' intent for the First Amendment was, not to compel anybody to support a state endorsed church or to prohibit them from worship or living according to their faith in whatever faith that may be. When you have so many people who, quote unquote, know about the separation of church and state, that leads to all these ridiculous decisions that we then have to go into court and challenge and hopefully overturn, and we're making progress. But it would be a great help to that work if the general population had a better understanding of what their rights are. And in a democratic republic, an inherent danger of a constitutionally illiterate voting population is that they vote for elected representatives who are just as constitutionally ignorant as they are, or they're more likely to fall for some constitutionally dubious idea like the most recent, we're going to pack the court if the left takes the presidency. Well, if you know anything about history, the last guy who tried that was FDR, and Democratic Congress opposed him. I don't think Democrats in this Congress would have that sort of fidelity to the Constitution if it happened.
No, and a lot of them are talking about maybe getting rid of the filibuster, because they recognize that even if you had a Democratic president, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic House, you still might not be able to pass everything because of the filibuster. So there are just all sorts of things. But let's talk about solutions for just a minute. I've said before that if we hadn't had the sorry history, Keisha, of Jim Crow, I would think that having just some requisite questions before someone's registered to vote would be appropriate. And I recognize that brings up all sorts of negatives. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't work. But I do know, and I've written commentaries about the fact that more and more states are now suggesting that in order to graduate from high school, you need to actually pass the citizenship test, which we give to individuals that are naturalized citizens. And when you look at what an individual who comes here from Germany, South Africa, India, Bangladesh, wherever it might be, and comes to this country, what he or she has to learn before they are then granted citizenship and the right to vote, oftentimes we have a situation where the naturalized citizens know more about our history and our government than the people that are born here. And so I don't know, that may be one solution. What are your thoughts?
I think it's a good solution, or at least it's a good start.
Yeah.
We just have to have people who are more informed about what the Constitution says. I mean, that's necessary if we want to have an informed voting population. I also think that it's up to leaders, including Congress, to start behaving in a way where, they're demonstrating that they also understand the Constitution and they want to promote those ideas and be objective about it, as opposed to promoting their own agendas. And I think that is, important for all leaders and people who have a platform to do that, and to, make sure that they're informing the youth, the public, and everything about what the Constitution actually says, and less about what they actually think.
Well, and again, Lathan, if you required that you had to pass the citizenship test, which, by the way, I looked at the other day, you only have to get 6 out of every 10 questions right. I mean, where was that when I was going to school? If you get 60%, you pass. That's pretty bad. Yeah. But immediately, we all know that what happens on the universities, what happens in even the public schools, is oftentimes they'll teach to a test. And especially if in high school, they have to pass this. They're going to teach to the test. Well, that's going to require at least the teachers just can't say, well, read it on your own. They're going to have to do a little bit of teaching about the Constitution, the Declaration, and the Federalist Papers, right?
I agree. I would be all in. Absolutely. I nominate Kerby Anderson for Secretary of Education, and that's the one priority. Let's get kids educated on those founding documents. The founders believed that the entire purpose of education was to create citizens capable of living in a civil society, a democratic republic.
Cultivate civic virtue and educate the populace and all those kinds of things.
You're going to have this sort of freedom that we have here. You have to have a moral population that's capable of living in that republic, in that free society. And that was their whole purpose for public education, was to create that citizenship that is capable of living in a free society. We talked about the Reagan quote earlier. Another one of his famous quotes is, "We don't pass this on in the bloodstream."
That's right.
So until we do a better job in public education of teaching these things, it's up to parents. If your kids are not learning at school, you have to teach them at home.
Yeah.
My daughters probably get tired of hearing me talk about all this stuff, but it's a big point of emphasis at our house, and they're in a great school that does teach these things, but I reinforce it as much as I can at home.
Yeah, they're going to be good citizens. The other thing I smile about is just imagine some of these teachers that have never read the Federalist Papers. Try to follow the logic of James Madison in Federalist Paper number 10 about factions, Federalist Paper number 51 about countervailing ambitions. First of all, that's going to set aside the idea that these people of the 19th century are a bunch of yahoos and weren't very intelligent. I mean, there are some pretty incredible arguments being made in the Federalist Papers, and it would probably be a bit of a challenge even for the teachers to make their way through some of those Federalist Papers, much less the students.
Absolutely. The Federalist Papers on intervening institutions, the arguments against a Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
And what that argument was, hey, if we start writing down the things that government can't do, people are going to think that's the only thing government can't do. And that was Madison's approach. I mean, the folks in favor of the written Bill of Rights eventually prevailed, and then they put them in the Constitution. But his idea was, if this Constitution does not specifically grant the authority, then the government does not have that authority.
Yeah.
And that's why he was reluctant to start listing the things that government couldn't do.
Well, the Anti-Federalists and everything. Written by Alexander Hamilton. Everybody knows him now because of the play. James Madison, and a few by John Jay, who should have written more but was a little bit sick at the time, but became the first Chief Justice of the United States. But at that time, when he wrote him, was, I think, the vice president of the Bible Society. Later, he was the president of the American Bible Society. Can you imagine now getting the current president of the American Bible Society, who's a good friend of mine, as a nominee for the Supreme Court? That might be controversial.
I think I could.
Might be.
I think I could figure out what the questioning from the Senate would be.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a break. We've got a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after these important messages.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have in studio with us today Keisha Russel as well as Lathan Watts, and they are both individuals that have gone to college and law school and graduated from those institutions, and so I thought it would be good to get their comments for just a minute on what some are calling Operation Varsity Blues. I don't know what it's eventually going to be called, but it's the college scandal. Now, the two most visible faces are Felicity Huffman, who is, of course, an Emmy winner and Oscar-nominated actress, probably best known for Desperate Housewives, married to William Macy, and Lori Loughlin, who was known probably for a lot of people as Aunt Becky on ABC's Full House, but also was on Hallmark movies, which my wife loves to watch. We will not see her there anymore. And, of course, they are just two of at least 50 different individuals who, in some cases, were using various kinds of means to get their children into, in the case of one, USC, others Yale, Stanford, Georgetown, University of Texas. You know, when you got graduate degrees from Yale and Georgetown, I feel like they've devalued my degree a little bit. But nevertheless, that's what we find. Teenage girl who did not play soccer magically became a star soccer recruit at Yale University. Her parents had to spend $1.2 million. Where did they come up with that money? This one individual that had never been on a crew team, shown sitting next to a crew skull, and actually said that she would be involved in the USC crew team, and the parents wired about $200,000 to a special account. And again, you can understand how parents want to help their kids. But Lathan, speak to this for just a minute. We've got a scandal that I think is going to unfold with ripples going all through the whole Ivy League situation, as well as many of the other elite schools.
Right, and I don't think it's going to be limited just to the Ivy League. I mean, this undermines people's confidence in yet another institution, which is higher ed. If they were already skeptical about some of the things that are being taught across the country in universities, that over the years, these places have become more like indoctrination centers into a way of thinking than, the pursuit of knowledge or wisdom. But this just undermines it even more. We like to think of America as a meritocracy, and that if you are smart enough and work hard enough, you can earn your spot into an institution like this. And this just, chips away at the credibility of that whole idea. And for all of the criticisms of standardized tests and standardized testing, and I do think, as you mentioned earlier, Kerby, people do kind of tend to teach too much to the test, but that's supposed to be the one objective standard for everybody who's trying to get into, whether it's the ACT, SAT for undergrad, or the LSAT for law school, or the GRE for grad school, whatever it is. That's why it's so important, is because this is the one thing that is supposed to be the same for everybody. Regardless of what background you came from educationally, you blow up that test, you got a good shot at getting into the university of your choice. And part of the scandal was people cheating on the test, or getting somebody to take the test for them. And it's just one more factor that undermines the credibility of an important institution in our culture.
Yeah, I think it's a shame because, if you're one of these students who applied to these schools and didn't get in, your question is, if I had had the money, would that have made a difference? You know, and that's a shame. It shouldn't be that way. And I think that, for me, my parents didn't really help me get into college in that way at all. Like I was kind of on my own. But I think there's some, merit to all of that, and my parents being able to bring me up in such a way where I can, decide for myself what I want to do. And thankfully I chose a proper direction.
Yes, you did.
So I think that, there's a lot of lessons to be learned here. One of those lessons is, understanding for a parent when it's just going too far and like imposing your own will on your child.
Again, this, I think, is going to have some ripple effects. There is something that John Stonestreet mentioned today in the Breakpoint commentary about a book, and I'm going to look it up, 2009, The Price of Admission, which was really just talking about how the entrance into some of these elite colleges already was kind of up for sale. Now, a lot of it wasn't necessarily a quid pro quo, but it sort of was that way. I learned when I was at Yale that there were individuals there because they were a legacy. Their parents, their grandparents had been there. They had given money to the endowment. It wasn't necessarily as obvious as these, but there was some similarity. My office mate, his name was Abbott Brush the Third, and it was from an elite group of individuals that were part of that kind of legacy. And so in some respects, that's the case. But you also, back to what Keisha is saying, you've all, I think, had experiences where you're standing in line to go to a movie, standing in line to go to a concert, you're going to buy a ticket, somebody jumps in the line, you go, hey, that's not fair. And that's bad enough. But then when you get to the window, you find out they've sold out, and you realize he just took my spot.
That's right.
And that's kind of the feeling that I think a number of these students at some of these universities have got to be feeling right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I heard this morning there's already class action lawsuits starting.
Sure.
Yeah, and there are people right now trying to qualify to get into that class to be a part of the class action lawsuits against these places. It'll be interesting to see how those play out and how you can, if there's a way you can prove, and that's the hard part in court.
That's going to be real tough.
Can you prove that this person getting this seat that was your spot? And especially when you have lots of applicants for a limited number of entrance seats into the freshman class at a university or law school or grad school or whatever it may be. But you mentioned this, Kerby. I think there is much more to come on this. It's I hate to keep repeating myself, but it's undermining people's confidence in our higher education system. And that used to be where American education sort of made up for our lacking in the elementary and secondary education. You'd see comparisons of fourth graders in America versus fourth graders in Japan, or high school seniors in America versus high school seniors in this country. And we were lagging behind, but where we made up for that was at the college and university level. We had some of the greatest universities in the world, and this chips away at that.
It does.
Well, is it about the best and the brightest getting into these universities, or is it, well, they may not be the best and the brightest, but mom and dad stroked a check for a couple $100,000 and magically they're now one of the best and the brightest.
Well, and it gets back to, I want to hear from both of you as lawyers. This is going to be difficult to prove. You've had some of these cases on affirmative action. They've gone all the way to the Supreme Court. And there, in some cases, you could prove that this individual did not get into this law school, did not get into this graduate school or whatever. This is going to be difficult for anyone to say that I have standing in a case, right? That's going to be difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the other thing, it's really difficult to prove what criteria was the final decision maker for a university, because there's all sorts of criteria. There's your GPA, there's your test scores, there's your extracurriculars, there's all kinds of stuff that, a lot of universities look at. So I think it's going to be difficult to prove that one criteria that you were missing was sort of filled in by this other individual. So...
Jim Dennison the other day pointed out something else, and that is, didn't they think they would get caught? Sooner
Obviously
or later.
not.
Yeah. And I love that, the scriptures, Numbers 32, verse 23, your sin will find you out, or Proverbs 10:9, whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but he who makes his ways crooked will be found out. There's a lesson for everybody to learn, and that is sometimes you think, oh, I got away with that. No, not necessarily. Sooner or later, the truth does seem to come out, doesn't it?
Or at least the FBI will catch you.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. The FBI. I mean, just pick alphabet soup. We have enough federal law enforcement agencies. Somebody's going to find it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, Harvard was already in trouble over their admissions policy. There was a lawsuit already
that's right.
that's still working its way through the courts, I believe. Asian Americans who were being discriminated against based on certain criteria. So this doesn't help by any stretch. We'll have to wait and see how that lawsuit plays out. But, it just usually the simplest way to decide something is usually the easiest way to decide it. And if you set a bright line standard, X number on the SAT versus this sort of GPA formula gets you a spot if it's open, that's the same for everybody.
Right.
And, regardless of who your parents were or how much money they gave, if you establish objective criteria, then you sort of eliminate, as best you can, room for this sort of thing to happen. And so when universities start getting into, all these other little bells and whistles, well,
That's when it gets complicated.
We need X percentage of the student population to be this race or this gender or this, whatever it is. It creates opportunities for situations like this, and that's what Harvard is already facing.
Sure. And that's one of the things I appreciate about these professional standards. Either you pass the bar or you don't pass the bar. Either you pass the real estate license and you're a realtor or you don't. I mean, some of those principles really are helpful. And the fuzziness of some of this, as well as we maybe can talk about when we come back from the break, just the fact that certain people tend to get off because they have good lawyers and others do not. It just undermines the whole kind of cultural fabric of our society. So we'll continue our conversation right after these important messages.
Monday, March 4th, was Read Across America Day, spearheaded by the National Education Association. This year, the NEA's sponsoring partner was the Human Rights Campaign, the nation's largest LGBT advocacy organization. The Read Across America tagline is celebrating a nation of diverse readers. Its website features recommended books. Prominent among them is I Am Jazz, written by a biological boy who is now Jazz, a transgender girl. That's the book chosen by an Arlington, Virginia kindergarten teacher, Jane Foster. The Washington Post reports that Human Rights Campaign spokesperson Sarah McBride read I Am Jazz to Mr. Foster's class. I have a girl brain in a boy body, she read. This is called transgender. I was born this way. According to the Post, after her reading, McBride told the children, I'm like Jazz. When I was born, the doctors and my parents, they all thought I was a boy. A little girl asked why, and McBride answered, because society, people around them told them that was the case. It took me getting a little bit older to be able to say that in my heart and in my mind, I knew I was really a girl. Why this full court press of the transgender agenda in schools? NEA President Lily Garcia explains that it stems from what she describes as the Trump administration's open hostility to this cause. The president rolled back his predecessor's bathroom mandate, the Obama administration's guidance instructing schools to allow students to use bathrooms that align not necessarily with their biological sex, but with their gender identity. The NEA's Garcia says that now, it is more important than ever that we speak out. We live in a culture that's been blinded and is becoming stupid because influencers have exchanged the truth about God for a lie. Family Research Council's Tony Perkins says these LGBT activists no longer have to hide. Now they are openly recruiting our kids. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Keisha Russel and Lathan Watts in studio with us. They're both with First Liberty. I thought we'd just get an update real quickly on a couple of these very important cases, because when we talk about this idea of the First Amendment, we have one on the Establishment Clause, one on the Free Exercise Clause. Establishment Clause, this could change dramatically with the Bladensburg Cross case, because it seems that you're asking a number of things, not the least of which, keep the cross up, don't cut off the arms, all the other things that have been suggested, but get rid of the Lemon test. Explain that, if you might, for a minute.
Sure. So the Lemon test comes from a case called Lemon versus Kurtzman. That's how it got dubbed the Lemon test. And we're fond of saying that the courts have been trying to make lemonade out of this lemon for a long time.
That's 1971, if I remember right.
Yeah.
It's
30 really old.
Yeah, 30 to 40 years old.
That's
And
really old. That's almost as old as me.
Yeah, right. And in that time, that test has really caused more confusion than it's solved.
Sure.
It's a 3-prong test. I won't get into all the details of each of the 3 questions, but if the subject matter in question violates any one of those 3, then according to Lemon, it has to be struck down as a violation of the Establishment Clause. And it had come to the point where just about every time the Lemon test was applied, whatever was in question was struck down.
Right.
So it's very confusing. It's very fact specific. Lower courts have had hard time applying it, and then for people in public office, which a lot of times this is the subject matter, it's where religion intersects with public life or in government or whatever, they clearly have a hard time applying it, and so it's really sort of created an environment of hostility towards any sort of religious expression or any sort of presence of religion in public anywhere, to where the instinct is just, well, get rid of it. And so when we argued at the Supreme Court, we were arguing basically for 2 wins, as you mentioned, Kirby. The first one being the specific to this monument, that it clearly does not violate the Establishment Clause. But then the second and the even bigger win would be, we suggested to the court a new, I shouldn't say new, it's really old, going back to the text of the First Amendment.
What a concept.
And a different way of analyzing these cases going forward, which would basically abandon the Lemon test and go to a test that's more rooted in the text of the Constitution, one that's more about a standard of coercion. Has anyone been coerced to worship something or in a way that conflicts with their beliefs, or compelled to support some sort of state-approved church? And if not, then the Establishment Clause has not been violated. So that's...
I'm driving by. I'm not coerced to look at the flag or the cross or menorah or anything, right?
Or even if you drive by and look at that cross in Bladensburg, Maryland, you're not coerced to worship anything. If you're compelled to do anything, it might be to remember that there were 49 men from Prince George's County who died for your freedom. That would be the only thing I can think of that you might be compelled to do, which is the point of war memorials and veterans memorials. That's why it was put there nearly 100 years ago. Yeah. So that's one of the big decisions we're waiting on. It was argued, and now we're waiting on the decision. So over the next few months, the justices will be writing their opinions, probably sharing them back and forth, and that's a crucial time for a case, because sometimes what they heard at oral argument, they start reading everybody else's opinion, and sometimes people change, the way they feel about a case, in that final opinion.
Yeah, please pray, y'all, for that. It's really important that we get that case law taken care of, and we get a proper test out there. And we'll never know how the judges are going to, or the justices are going to vote on it. And we just want to make sure that, the decision that we get is in line with what the Constitution requires and the intention of the Constitution. And that's what we're after.
Well, and again, back to what Lathan was saying, Keisha, you have notebooks full of material, and it took this long, this much paper. Think of all the trees that had to die for this in order to finally get a decision. You can understand why somebody in a city council or a mayor or a county clerk goes, I don't know, I don't know where this fits.
Right,
This Lemon test is too complex. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to even allow it because I don't want to get sued. Right,
and even, the opposing side sort of, they never agreed that we should get rid of the Lemon test, but they agreed that we shouldn't use it in, this situation. So there's a lot of problems with the Lemon test, and we just want, at the end of the day, the test that we use to comply with the Constitution, and that's it.
Let's take one other one. We've talked about the Establishment Clause. There's also a Free Exercise Clause, which has sort of gotten lost somewhere, and that
is
goes.
There?
I
think I've read that
used
somewhere.
to live in the state of Oregon for a while, and I'm very familiar with what's called the Smith decision, which led into the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And the other day, when I had the son of Antonin Scalia, and we were talking about the book. I didn't bring that up, but this is one of those times when I think maybe he ruled the wrong way. So this is another one. And as I understand, Keisha, you have, first of all, Coach Kennedy's case, and then you have Aaron and Melissa Klein. Either or both of those could be a challenge of that. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so in the Coach Kennedy case, we asked the Supreme Court to look at that. They did deny cert on that case, but they left a little note, and part of that note discusses the Smith case and the reason we brought the case as a free speech case. But the point is that the court kind of opened the door to overturning that decision, possibly.
It looked like a wink and a nod to me.
It did. It just kind of like, nobody has asked us to overturn this. That's basically what.
So why don't you come back and do so?
Right. And so we'd be happy to do that. Thankfully, Coach Kennedy will take a while to come back up, but we did ask for the court to review Smith in the Klein case, not just overturn it, but if they're not going to overturn it, to at least clarify the doctrine that is, specified in that case, because it hasn't been applied the way the case sort of lays it out. And we think it's time for the Supreme Court to take a look at that decision again.
I'm just thinking that, if First Liberty is at the center of overturning the Lemon test and the Smith, oh my goodness, you're going to get it more than just a footnote in the history of legal annals, aren't you? Because this would be just a complete grand slam home run, wouldn't it?
Monumental.
Yeah, it would be. It would be a turning point in history. And it's for constitutional lawyers, for folks that just work in the legal profession, the blessing that it is to be working at First Liberty right now with this potential shift happening. I mean, it is hard to overstate the impact that it will have if they overturn both of those decisions.
Yeah.
There's the reason that the reason that a lot of these cases have happened, our other clients in our other cases, have been because of this Smith decision. What it did, it really lowered the bar for judicial scrutiny on claims for free exercise cases. And that's where, as you said, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act came from. It was a direct response to this case, trying to raise the bar of scrutiny again to get it back to where it had been.
And where it should be.
Yeah, exactly. And you're right. I mean, if nothing else, the fact that it's a Scalia opinion, just it proves nobody's perfect. Nobody gets them all right. We still like a lot of his opinions, just not that one.
Yeah, and I think, to defend that, I don't know if when the Smith decision came out, that was his intention, that it was going to be used to sort of eradicate free exercise, which is how it's been used.
That's how it was used, yeah.
Hopefully we're able to get that decision going, and all the hard work that's gone into First Liberty's work, and even other organizations that do this kind of work. I think.
Let me just say, if nothing else, we have, of course, you can click on either one of their pictures, and it will take you to First Liberty. First of all, I would encourage you to sign up to get their newsletter. This is just a great opportunity for you to be praying for what is taking place right now, and we just gave you a little bit of a look behind the scenes and what could unfold, and that is remarkable. Even yesterday when we had Joel Rosenberg, at one point when he met the president, he said, Mr. President, I got to admit, I was a never Trumper till the Thursday before the election. And he said, what changed your mind? He said, well, it's when my wife said, you've known Mike Pence for years. You're going to not vote for Donald Trump just because you don't like him? And he said, I regret my decision because you have now put more qualified judges on the court, which now are going to make decisions about this in the future. And so it was kind of an interesting story that he told. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
The leader looked around the table, motioning to the older men. He said, "You're here to remind us how faithful God has been in the past. Now, you middle-aged guys, you keep us focused on what God is doing right now. Make sure we don't stop. And you younger guys, keep us looking forward. Imagine what God wants us to be doing in the years to come." There's a lot of wisdom there. We have to be thankful for the past, focused on the present, and mindful to plan for a great future. Many listeners have made bold moves to partner with Point of View Radio and accomplish great things for more than 45 years. But as we look around, we do see many positive things, and I think we can all admit there's a lot more to be done. It's time to think about your next bold move, what you can do to invest for our nation's future. Be thinking about that. If you have an answer now, don't wait. Make your next bold move now. Give online at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. It's our future. The time is now. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our weekend edition. If you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. We are privileged to have both lawyers from First Liberty, Lathan Watts and Keisha Russel. And a little bit later, we'll get into some of the religious liberty issues. I might, as a program note, mention that one of the articles we've posted by Lathan is It Starts in South Carolina. What starts in South Carolina could go around the country. Of course, that goes back to the Civil War, but here we're talking about constitutional literacy, so we'll get to that in just a little bit. But on a serious note, for a few minutes, let's, if we can, talk about what has happened in New Zealand. 49 people killed in a mass shooting at two different mosques in New Zealand. This is a place which many people think is a very safe place to go. I have friends that every year travel from here to New Zealand, live there each year long enough so they can establish residency. One, because if they decide later they want to retire, they can do so, or if they are convinced that someday something might hit the fan and they need to get out of the United States, they'll go to New Zealand. And yet here is a good example of two individuals who are held in custody, along with one man who is arrested and charged with murder. So three individuals that have gone into these mosques and killed these Muslims. And Lathan, any thoughts about what has actually transpired there in New Zealand?
Well, obviously it's tragic is, the overused word, but it is. And, I hate to think that this is becoming more and more normal in our world, but I think these things start to sort of feed themselves. And
I think so too.
You have, the attack in Pittsburgh on a synagogue, and then you have an attack on a mosque. And if there are people who are prone to this sort of behavior to begin with, then these sorts of things start to build upon each other. And, you take what has happened, over the last few years in different parts of the world with Islamic fundamentalist terrorist actions, and now somebody who is clearly, I don't think in his right mind, acts on the worst impulses a human being can have, but he sort of feels justified in doing what he's doing because he sees it as a reaction to the whatever the previous attack by some extremist from that faith. And so the things start to compound and they start to feed each other. And there's no silver. Well, that's a bad analogy. I'm not going to say.
Mm-hmm.
Usually I would say there's no silver bullet solution to this, but I'm not going to. That's a poor choice of words on my part. There's no one way really to fix this problem. It's going to be a combination of a lot of things, but the main thing is just people seeing each other as human beings again, and the lack of empathy for someone who may not share your faith or your worldview or your politics or whatever it may be, but still seeing them as a child of God and respecting their status as a child of God is something that has to be restored here and around the world. And sadly, I think the reports were still coming in about this, and the politicization. I always struggle on that word.
Yeah.
But people trying to score political points, let me say it that way, started before the news reports were even complete here, and that's another sort of sad commentary on our culture, that people instantly jump to try to score some political points or point fingers at someone or some organization based on what happened thousands of miles away.
Blame the NRA when they're not in New Zealand. Blame Donald Trump because he's not the president.
Exactly.
Before we get to that, though, I thought I mentioned, you said something in passing that we've talked about before, especially with David French, who's been sitting in that chair, and that is Malcolm Gladwell says that what this could be seen as is a slow-motion riot. And what he means by this is every act lowers the threshold. Mm-hmm. If you've ever been in a riot, I was born in Berkeley, I've seen some riots. Nobody throws a chair through a window, but as soon as somebody does, that lowers the threshold, and all of a sudden somebody else throws a rock or something else. Nobody swings at anybody, but as soon as a punch is thrown, all of a sudden it lowers the threshold. And there is a sense in which when we do so much of this publicity of these terrorists, and I'll call these individuals domestic terrorists in New Zealand, and here in the United States, and of course we have Muslim terrorists and all sorts of others. We have anti-Semitism, which we talked about yesterday with Joel Rosenberg. It lowers the threshold. So there is a sense in which these feed on themselves. So that's one of those issues. But Keisha, we've also mentioned that when I first heard this, I just was thinking about, it's so sad because New Zealand is such a safe place. Just didn't even cross my mind until I started looking at the Twitter feeds that people are going to blame Donald Trump, the National Rifle Association. Candace Owens got to criticize. I mean, after a while, everybody's in the crosshairs, and I'd kind of like us to have a time of mourning before we start pointing fingers, don't you think?
Yeah, I think there's definitely should be some time to sort of reflect on what's going on. And, as I said, I mean, you can only blame the person who pulls the trigger for the actions that happened, and that happen, consistently now. But I don't know if you can even say that there is such a thing as a safe place, because human beings are everywhere,
right.
and
dangerous everywhere.
Right. And all kinds of human beings are dangerous. And so I don't know if there's even necessarily a safe place to be free of these things. But I think it does help to just sort of remember that everyone who died was a human being just like we are. And we should be praying and have our thoughts with the families of those people.
And again, even saying thoughts and prayers get you in trouble, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. That one's baffling to me, and as I think we mentioned before, if somebody criticizes you for offering thoughts and prayers, they, in my opinion, have no concept of the power of prayer.
Yes.
If you knew anything about the comfort that people receive knowing that people are praying for them, then you would not criticize somebody for offering to do that for another human being.
Well, and again, this one was an attack against Muslims by an individual that, at least if you read his manifesto, and I don't recommend it for your morning quiet time, but individuals that have said he doesn't necessarily support Donald Trump. He seems to be pretty critical of him. He certainly has pulled off some of the ideas of white supremacism. It looks a little bit like the other kind of domestic terrorist. Was it Norway or something like that? Some of these manifestos are just rambling kinds of statements. But nevertheless, I did want to open by talking a little bit about that to recognize it over the next few days. Maybe we'll learn some more. But it gets back to the issue of the evil that's in the world. Mm-hmm. And in this particular case, evil against Muslims who probably did not deserve, I'm sure did not, I shouldn't even qualify that, we did not deserve to be attacked. We yesterday, of course, talked about the attacks against Jewish people. When you look at the hate crimes statistics for the FBI, if you compare it through a number of years, they've sort of declined slightly or stayed about the same. But one real outlier jumps out, and that is in many of those cases, 2 years ago especially, a majority of them were anti-Semitic attacks. So again, if nothing else, not only pray for Muslim believers, but for Jewish believers. And of course, around the world, we know how Muslim countries oftentimes attack Christians and Jews. So there are, again, reminders of the kind of hate that's in the world. We're going to spend some time talking about that today. Matter of fact, one of the articles is called Partisan Hate. We'll get to that later. But we also have one more candidate running for the Democratic nomination for president. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In a previous set of commentaries, I talked about the interview Nick Pitts and I did with Jonathan Haidt on his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Then I saw an essay that quoted his earlier book, The Righteous Mind, where he talked about the conservative advantage. As a liberal, he wrote the book because he was convinced that American liberals do not get the morals and motives of their conservative countrymen. In one study he did with Jesse Graham and Brian Nozick, they tested how well liberals and conservatives could understand each other. They had the people fill out the Moral Foundation's questionnaire. 1/3 of the time they were supposed to fill out the questions normally, answering as themselves. 1/3 of the time they were asked to fill out the questions as they think a typical liberal would respond. And 1/3 of the time they were supposed to fill out the questionnaire the way they believed a typical conservative would respond. The design of the research allowed the researchers to examine the stereotypes that each side had about the other. This also allowed them to see how accurate their answers were compared to people who were liberal and people who were conservative. They concluded that the results were clear and consistent. Moderates and conservatives were most accurate in their predictions, whether they were pretending to be liberals or conservatives. Liberals were the least accurate, especially those who described themselves as very liberal. I might add that this study was published 10 years ago. I think that it's even more likely that the gap in perception by liberals of conservatives has grown even more. Much of what Jonathan Haidt has written about in his recent books illustrates how millennial college students want even more protection from ideas they don't like. They're less likely than before to engage foreign ideas. And this is one example of why we have such polarization in the political arena. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Thinking Man Films, Patterns of Evidence, The Moses Controversy. Did Moses write the first books of the Bible? Patterns of Evidence in theaters March 14th, 16th, and 19th only.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, another candidate is announced for the presidency on the Democratic side, and that is Robert Francis O'Rourke, former member of Congress known as Beto O'Rourke, and we'll refer to him. And so that makes either 16 or 17, depends on whether you count Howard Schultz in or out, who is the former CEO of Starbucks. But you're talking about Kamala Harris, you're talking about Elizabeth Warren, Kristen Gillibrand, as well as a number of people that you probably haven't heard of, Julian Castro. Of course, we can't forget Cory Booker and Bernie Sanders, and probably Joe Biden, although he's not in the race right at the moment. The reason I thought it would be important to talk about this is that I have two ideas that are being presented simultaneously by many of the people who watch these elections. Some say that they think that the nominees will be Joe Biden as president, Beto O'Rourke as vice president. That's one theory. The other, and give full credit to Colonel Allen West, who a year and a half ago was saying that he thinks it will be Kamala Harris. One of the articles we've posted here is called Lanes in the Democrat Field. Now, if you have a printer, make sure you have enough paper in the printer, because this is 30 pages by an individual, by the way, I tend to really accept. I've used his research in the past, and he goes into, and you both have looked at it now, and I can see your eyes glaze over a little bit. I mean, goes into such detail about when the primaries are and a variety of other things, and concludes that maybe the odds-on favorite is Kamala Harris. And that's a possibility. And it really brings us back to one of the articles we've posted here, and that is the idea that this is going to possibly be, it says, in the woke war against Beto, root for, or Beto, because otherwise it'll be Bernie Sanders. That's another argument David French has. And what he means is I wrote a commentary back in February in which I said this may be the first so-called woke primary. Now, what in the world do I mean? Woke means somebody who's supposed to be alert, sensitive to injustice, And, of course, we've been hearing about, the governor in the state of Virginia and having a picture of blackface in his medical school yearbook. But it goes long beyond that, and that is now almost any potential slight is used against a candidate. And so, of course, Elizabeth Warren, the slight against her is representing herself to be Native American. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand was confronted on television the other day because she used, are you ready for this, a word a number of years ago, the words illegal alien, and had to apologize for using the words illegal alien. Of course, Senator Kamala Harris, her criticism, she's been a prosecutor. And, of course, you can talk about some of the scandals that associated with Bernie Sanders' team. Now they've dug up some old video of Joe Biden. And my argument is that this is not a good time for a white male, and Beto O'Rourke is a white male. So that's kind of the concern, that more and more of them are saying, oh, he's just drips with white male privilege and those kinds of things. So this will be the most interesting presidential primary I think I've ever seen in my lifetime.
I think you're right. Interesting is a generous term.
But let's sell tickets.
Exactly. There's so many announced candidates and then potential candidates. I think we should do like the NCAA tournament, like March Madness for the Democratic primary, and let's have a series of debates, and everybody will fill out their brackets, and we'll do this. We'll have it.
I love it.
I mean, I don't know how they're going to fit everybody on the stage. I mean, the Republican primary last time was as
17,
crowded as
this is already getting more crowded. Yeah,
it is, and the dynamics at play in this article that you're talking about, that seem to go against Beto. We've talked about this before, Kirby. When you have built a party on a coalition of different identity groups,
that's right,
and inevitably one of those groups is going to be at odds with the other one, and so now he's being described, criticized for being the white male privilege candidate. The fact that there are plenty of people who voted for him in Texas, I think, who voted based on the nickname and just sort of ignored the O'Rourke part of the name. This guy, wealthy family, Irish, not much of a record of achievement of his own.
More like a Kennedy, less like a Hispanic.
I was
right?
just about to say he's got a DUI record that thankfully he didn't kill anybody. If he had killed somebody, they would have made him an honorary Kennedy. That's about the only thing that he hasn't done. So here's a guy, the headwinds against him in this primary are considerable.
Huge. Yes. Which is why some people said maybe not as president, but maybe as a VP, but we'll see.
Right. And that's, I think, the point of David French's article is, compared to the others, you kind of want, French is saying you should want him to win. I don't know that I go that far, because Beto is trying to run the same kind of playbook that President Obama did in the first time that he ran, and that he is sort of presenting himself as this, blank slate upon which all of your projections can be placed, and whatever you want him to be, he is. And that's why you never really hear him take a real position on an issue. It's a lot of
other than tearing down the wall and pro-abortion and a few others, and Green New Deal. Yeah,
but he obfuscates when he gets asked a direct question.
That's true.
And he panders to whatever audience he's in front of, and that person walks away thinking how cool Beto is, and the cool factor that Obama had in his first election. I think that's exactly what he's trying to play into. He tried it in the Senate race here and got very close to winning.
Yes.
He's a dangerous candidate. I mean, people, you can laugh at him, and I do, but you can't just write him off either.
Yeah, the president made a comment about him moving his hands a lot. And of course, that led to the late night TV shows having a little fun with him. But Keisha, this is getting pretty crowded. And it is striking that, when he even made his announcement, he talked about some concerns that he had and the need for him to be involved. And then he goes to Iowa and says basically that we're on the edge of an apocalypse. We have to implement the Green New Deal, or humanity could go extinct unless we fix the planet in 12 years. What?
Well, we'll see what happened in year 13 when we're still all here. But, I think the issue, first of all, is that race or gender should never be a factor in us deciding who we're going to vote for as president.
Thank you.
But for whatever reason, that's where we are right now.
That's
and there's,
yeah.
a lot of historical reasons why that is. But, I think the Democratic Party is kind of, digging its own grave in some way by, promoting these ideas about white male privilege when you're going to have candidates that agree with your position that are white and might be privileged in some ways financially or whatever. And so you're going to cut against your arguments by saying race and gender shouldn't be a factor, but you're not going to vote for somebody because he's white and male.
Yes. Well, and again, that's kind of one of the issues is that if this becomes a woke primary, and there's a possibility that it will be, that because of the hashtag Me Too, because of the white male privilege, because of intersectionality, and we can go through this long list of filters, Lathan, that oftentimes are used by certain voters, you might not have anybody at the finish line. And you've had some individuals. When Bill Maher the other day says, let's not eat our own, he's recognizing what might turn into an incredible meat grinder for almost every one of these Democratic candidates.
It absolutely could, and especially considering how long the primary process is going to be. If they're already talking now, you already got candidates out campaigning. The primaries themselves is actually a compressed schedule. Once they start, it's going to be over quickly. But the campaign leading up to it is so long, and it gives so many people so many opportunities to say something stupid, like Uncle Joe Biden. I mean, just put that guy in front of a microphone for a while and just let him go. It will happen. So it is going to create, a lot of opportunities for this. And when you have a crowded field like this, it's similar to what happened with the Republicans when Trump won the nominee. People laughed about Trump when he got into it also. And you have 16, 17 guys running. Everybody kind of trying to stake out that ground as I'm the outsider candidate until somebody who has literally never held office before walks in. And now the most outsider of outsiders doesn't look like it compared to Trump. And all of a sudden he walks away with the nomination because you had so many other guys who were picking off constituencies of themselves, and he identifies with this. He's got this one core group of people that stick with him no matter what, and he ends up winning the nomination. So you could actually, even with as many candidates as the Democrats already have, there's also the likelihood that somebody we haven't even talked about yet
it is possible
comes in out of nowhere, and everybody who is sort of tired of all these other people, sniping at each other for the next year and a half just goes,
I'm just going to pick
how'd you go with that guy?
Yeah. Unfortunately, the time's going to run out real quick because, as I've pointed out, this is front-loaded like never before. I said this a week ago, and somebody said, nah. I said, by this time next year, we will know who the nominee is. And again, let me remind you, on March 3rd next year, both Texas and California vote on March 3rd, not to mention all the others during that Super Tuesday. It might be over by this time next year, which is why the first debates for the Democrats are in June. Now they're talking about even maybe May. And here we are, March. So again, you can see what we're talking about. So anyway, let's take a break. If you'd like to join us, maybe you have some thoughts about what's happened in the Democratic Party, give us a call.
Here's some great news. If you missed the deadline to sign up for health insurance, or more importantly, if you sign up for a plan that you're just not happy with, you still have a choice. It's called Medi-Share, and Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing program. It's been around for 25 years. They have more than 400,000 members now around the country. And get this, over the years, Medi-Share members have shared more than $2 billion of each other's medical bills, so they could help share your needs too. And best of all, you could save a lot of money with Medi-Share. The typical savings for a family is around $500 a month. Your savings could be more or less, but think about what you could do with that extra money every month. So if you think you're stuck with a high-cost health plan that doesn't have much to offer, think again. You can join Medi-Share anytime, so call them today and check it out. There's no pressure. They're super easy to talk to. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
In studio with us today, Lathan Watts and Keisha Russel. They're both with First Liberty Lawyers, and a little bit later we're going to talk a little bit about what starts in South Carolina about constitutional literacy, because I think you're really going to enjoy this piece by Lathan Watts, and really it's a great time to educate you about that and some of the religious liberty issues. But since we're in the midst of a presidential campaign, I know you wouldn't know that necessarily watching the mainstream media, but again, let me come back to the point I just made. The last article, I think it's now the fifth article on our piece, is one called The 5 Lanes in the Democratic Field. Well, if you scroll down, it actually gives you the primaries for the Democrats. I have a pretty good idea who the Republican nominee is going to be. The Democratic nominee, not so much. And, of course, you have Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada and South Carolina in February. And so, first of all, of course, Iowa is a caucus. Nevada is a caucus, but you have 2 primaries, New Hampshire and South Carolina. Now, after that point, it winnows the field, but what happens on March 3rd? Let me just read those off. That's Colorado, California, Texas, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Tennessee, Alabama, Oklahoma, Vermont, Delaware, and American Samoa. It's pretty much over.
Yeah, that's
and
it.
if you don't think so, then just a few days later, you have Louisiana and Kansas, which is on the 7th. That's on that weekend. And then the next week, on the 10th, it is over by then. Ohio, Michigan, Missouri, Mississippi, Maine, and a couple, Indiana, I guess it's Idaho. And so you can see everything is front-loaded. Keisha, that says money really means a difference, and name identification does. You know, I can say Tulsi Gabbard, even Julian Huxley, and people go, I don't know who that is.
Yeah.
You know, Joe Biden, yeah, I've heard that name.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
definitely going to make a difference if he decides to enter the race. So money definitely matters, and raising it very quickly.
And that's one thing that Beto was able to do in the Senate race. He raised money all over the country.
Money-making machine. Yeah.
And the reason it's so important when you have the schedule compressed like that is because you're going to have to be advertising in all of those states all at the same time.
I know.
Because you're not physically going to be able to campaign in all of those places enough, all at the same time to do it retail politics.
Right.
So you're going to have to, it's going to have to be TV ads and radio commercials and internet and all of these things. And that costs money.
And Texas
alone.
California? I mean,
the major media markets in Texas and California alone,
yeah,
the price tag will be astronomical. So it will be about who can raise money and who can raise it quickly. Who can start out of the gate with enough money to start advertising in those places to overcome the name ID issue. If you've got a name ID issue, it's going to compress that schedule. And I think it will winnow the field pretty quickly.
And again, those are all primaries. Remember that, of course, we have to go all the way back to Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Some of those were caucuses, and so that was something that helped Barack Obama a little bit as well. That they've been, the focus at the time on the Clinton campaign was on the primaries, but they were looking at primaries and caucuses, but these are all primaries. So again, it's just the tremendous amount of money. But there's something else, and that is it's always been a truism, at least of the modern political realm, that the Republicans had to run to the conservative, run to the right, and then head to the middle. And in this case, the president is just the president, so he doesn't even worry about that. But the Democrats always had to run to the left and run to the middle. But the left is a lot further out. If you can see my arm right now, it is out there like never before. Let me just mention a few. Medicare for all, something we talked about this week. Green New Deal, abortion till your birthday, which is something a little more unusual, full college tuition or free college tuition, guaranteed basic income, living wage, abolish ICE, immigration, customs, and enforcement, eliminate private health insurance, at least Kamala Harris talked about that. Some of the newest ones, government daycare and reparations. That's just the short list of what has been endorsed by most of these candidates. I'm thinking middle America goes, what? Talk about that.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, traditionally you run to your base, you appeal to your base in the primary because you're only talking to your people. And so if you're a Republican, the more conservative the base is, the more conservative candidate is probably going to be the one that wins that primary, and vice versa on the left.
Mm-hmm.
The problem, as you have identified, is that the left has gone so far left that the positions you will have to take to win that primary are not likely to win you a lot of voters in the middle when you come to the general election. That is the coalition that really handed the election to Donald Trump. It was the old, what they used to term the Reagan Democrats, the blue collar, the working class,
the Rust Belt,
mm-hmm. folks who really have felt like the Democratic Party had forgotten about them or taken their vote for granted or abandoned them. When you have President Obama saying things like, well, you'll still be able to produce coal in this country. You'll just go bankrupt trying to do it. Well, if you're a coal miner, and
doesn't help you in West Virginia.
That doesn't.
Not what you want to hear.
Exactly. And so then, and even, President Obama even sort of made fun of Donald Trump, saying there's no way these jobs are coming back. Well, does he have a magic wand who's going to bring these jobs back, when he was out talking to these people saying we are going to bring manufacturing jobs back. We are going to bring coal mining jobs back. And, these blue collar folks, that resonated with him. And it was enough to get him Michigan and Ohio and these states that he absolutely had to win if he was going to beat Hillary Clinton. And as you said, these positions that are now sort of common amongst the Democratic nominees, I don't think those really play well with what used to be a reliable voting bloc in the Democratic Party. So there's one of two things, really, and really neither one of them are good for the eventual Democratic nominee. They might, if they were kind of Trump Democrats, come back and vote for Trump again, or maybe they've soured on Trump. Who knows? But they look at their guy and they're like, well, I can't vote for that either, so I'm just staying home.
Yeah,
and so if that's the case, and their turnout is low, then you're probably looking at another Trump win.
Yeah. Keisha, I'd love to get your comments, because you start looking at these primaries, and in some of these states, I mean, you've gone to school in Georgia, Lathan's gone to school in Mississippi. First of all, it doesn't play very well in the South, but I don't think it plays very well in the Midwest either, does it?
No, some of those, I don't think a lot of those ideas play well in any of those areas, and because they're so extreme, there's a lot of objectivity missing from those pieces of paper over there, and you're just going to need a lot more to catch those voters.
Yes. Earlier this week we talked about Medicare for All, and I still want to commend this article by Wesley J. Smith, because he took the time to read the entire bill, Medicare for All Act of 2019, and he lived to tell about it. But, first of all, there were 9 points, and I'll just mention a few. First of all, it would drown the country in red ink, and even before they added, Bernie Sanders now has added also dental care and long-term care, but even before they did that and they did the evaluation, it would add $32 trillion, that's with a T, $32 trillion to the budget over 10 years. That's a deal breaker right there. But number two is rationing, because the bill creates a physician practice review board to determine the cost effectiveness of this. And again, if you're young like you individuals and you break your arm, no problem. If you're my age or older and you need kidney dialysis, you need heart bypass, they're going, maybe sure that's not cost effective. And so there is the issue of rationing. Then, of course, it also says that the doctors and hospitals have to sign this participation agreement, which essentially means the doctors and the hospitals become like government contractors, which I think would be a real surprise to a lot of people in the medical profession. And I'll just pick one more. They also said that if the pharmaceutical companies don't agree with the prices that they set, they will take their patents back from them. And you can begin to think about the lack of innovation of life-saving treatments, drugs, and all the rest. So as people begin to hear a little bit more about this, it was one thing when Bernie Sanders presented this years ago. Last time Bernie Sanders was there, and there were 16 people, all Democrats, all senators, many of whom are running for the presidency, agreeing with that. I just don't think that wears very well with the American people.
No, and you don't have to study this in the abstract and know what will happen. I mean, there are examples of this right now.
Yes.
There's There's socialized medicine in other countries. There's government-run healthcare right now.
Yeah.
Ask people that are on Medicare. Ask people who get their health care from the VA.
Yeah.
And ask them about this. And 32 trillion over 10 years. Just please, nobody tell our elected officials there's a number higher than trillion.
Yeah, I mean, and even ask parents, overseas who were fighting to keep their child on life support, and it was decided that's not cost effective, and we're not going to do that anymore.
You can see where that leads. Okay, let's take some phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We haven't even talked about the border or immigration, so that's our first phone call. We'll get into that issue. There was a vote on that, and we'll talk about that and take some phone calls right after these important messages.
Monday, March 4th, was Read Across America Day, spearheaded by the National Education Association. This year, the NEA's sponsoring partner was the Human Rights Campaign, the nation's largest LGBT advocacy organization. The Read Across America tagline is celebrating a nation of diverse readers. Its website features recommended books. Prominent among them is I Am Jazz, written by a biological boy who is now Jazz, a transgender girl. That's the book chosen by an Arlington, Virginia kindergarten teacher, Jane Foster. The Washington Post reports that Human Rights Campaign spokesperson Sarah McBride read I Am Jazz to Mr. Foster's class. I have a girl brain in a boy body, she read. This is called transgender. I was born this way. According to the Post, after her reading, McBride told the children, I'm like Jazz. When I was born, the doctors and my parents, they all thought I was a boy. A little girl asked why, and McBride answered, because society, people around them, told them that was the case. It took me getting a little bit older to be able to say that in my heart and in my mind, I knew I was really a girl. Why this full court press of the transgender agenda in schools? NEA President Lily Garcia explains that it stems from what she describes as the Trump administration's open hostility to this cause. The president rolled back his predecessor's bathroom mandate, the Obama administration's guidance instructing schools to allow students to use bathrooms that align not necessarily with their biological sex, but with their gender identity. The NEA's Garcia says that now, it is more important than ever that we speak out. We live in a culture that's been blinded and is becoming stupid because influencers have exchanged the truth about God for a lie. Family Research Council's Tony Perkins says these LGBT activists no longer have to hide. Now, they are openly recruiting our kids. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Weekend edition, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to take some phone calls here, and then a little bit later we're going to get into some of the stories coming out of South Carolina. The South Carolina legislature and its flagship university seem to be at odds about whether or not to teach kids about the Constitution, the Declaration, and the Federalist Papers. That's one of the articles we've posted here by Lathan Watts, but let's take some phone calls because we are at the moment talking about this upcoming presidential election. And so, Colin in Missouri, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, I'm speaking out for our president, Donald Trump, and first. And it's not a witch hunt; it's a smoke screen. They're trying to disguise what they're up to, and everybody walking across the border, they're announcing that they're in another country to a play. They get over here, and I pay tithes to a place, and it helps pay 30,000 children for food and clothing in Mexico. So I don't have no hate for Mexico. There's a lot of good people, but this has happened before. When Cuba came across here, they released 14,000 criminals out of prison and sent them over here. And Mexico will flush as many criminals in here as we'll allow to walk across. And I know people that go down there, they kill people down there over drugs, and we don't want them up in here with our family. I think Donald Trump's going to win, and that people need their short-term memory. They don't remember. And what's going on, why they want them in here, I don't know.
Well, I think part of it is maybe as a possible constituency, but let's get to that. The border issues for just a minute. First of all, let me just mention in passing that you had an attempt to say that President Trump's use of an emergency declaration on the border is unconstitutional. And of course, I would rather have the courts deal with that than the House. But again, because you had 12 Republicans actually vote with the Democrats, then now there is a good possibility the president will veto that piece of legislation. I got this piece by Senator Ben Sasse, who on the one hand voted no and so supported the president, but did so by saying, look, I will be the first to admit that this emergency act, this declaration that has been used and misused, is overly broad. So on the one hand, let me just simply say that I think it is time for Congress to rein that in, but that's not reason enough to say that the president doesn't have the right to use it given the way it's been interpreted in the past. And I thought that was kind of a middle balanced perspective on that. Not that everybody agreed with it, but nevertheless, we'll see what kind of battle takes place now over this emergency declaration.
Right, and that, I think Sasse is right. If you have a problem with the president exercising this authority that was given to him by statute, and if you think that it's been abused or that the statute is written in a way that it's overused by the executive branch or it's led to executive overreach, well, the answer is then to change the statute.
Yeah, fix it.
Amend the statute. Yeah, bring it up, change it, and in the future, presidents won't be able to do what you're concerned about. But as it is written, that if the president is acting according to the statute as it is currently written, I don't think you can say that he is violating the Constitution by exercising authority that's been given to him via statute. If you have a problem with the statute, fix the statute.
Yeah. And again, this is a vote to try to embarrass the president, but if nothing else, the border issues are going to be an important issue, I would think. And let's take some more phone calls real quickly. We'll go to the state of Georgia, WLPE. Richard, what's on your mind?
Yeah, Kerby, I was listening to your assessment of how the leftists or the Democrats are going so far left. But another way that they can work, and when you're doing battle, there's multiple fronts. I was in the military for a long time, and one of the other fronts they're going to is voter fraud and illegal aliens voting, and
right.
And changing the polls to where it may look like we're going conservative, but then the underlining thing is to do that and then bring the vote in. Like I think I've heard that may have happened in Minnesota with that one Muslim lady that supposedly Obama shipped a bunch of people there, and that's how she got elected. I don't know.
Well, and the other one that I mentioned in one of my commentaries is the whole idea of ballot harvesting in Southern California, which is called Orange County. You have most of the time elected Republicans. And as a matter of fact, if you look at my commentary on that, we even have the map showing before and after. And ballot harvesting means, and I'd love to get your comments, Keisha, about this, that I can go to your house, and if you haven't filled out your absentee ballot, I can show you how to do that, and then I can take it in for you instead of having you take it in or having a family member take it in. So we can allow people that you don't know come to your house, get your ballot, and then deposit that ballot for you. What possibly could go wrong there, right?
Oh, a lot could possibly go wrong, but there's got to be. I mean, it's voting, and every individual needs to learn how to exercise that right. You know what I mean? So you don't want someone else doing that for you
and telling you how to fill out your ballot.
Right. I mean, there's just a certain level of ownership that has to happen when you're exercising the right to vote.
And again, ballot harvesting actually is legal in California. It is illegal in North Carolina, and there's a court case there about whether or not that member of Congress will stay in Congress. Matter of fact, it's pretty obvious it will not. So that's another issue, and this is why I certainly am encouraging all of you, pay attention what's happening in your own community. I'm a precinct chairman, and in our particular county now, we have voting machines that actually give a paper record so that we can begin to eliminate any possibility of mischievous kinds of activities. Probably a nice way to say it. But let's take another phone call real quickly. And this time we'll go to California, KCBC. And Mary Lou, thank you for joining us.
Hi. The question that I wanted to ask is about when the people get to the border, are they sent back or are they let in and then they start evaluating them?
Well, it depends on what you're talking about. Let's say that I show up at the border and I say I'm seeking asylum. Okay, well, we can only keep you and your kids, especially your kids, for a certain number of days. And since we have more people seeking asylum than we have judges to evaluate those, we finally have to say, well, we'll let you go and you'll go into the general population, but then come back, say, on April 5th for your hearing, and they just never show up again. So that's how the game is played right now, because we actually are overwhelming the system at the border, right?
That's exactly right, and that's been the case for many years. You get assigned a court date for an immigration judge to rule on your case, and you're expected to show up. Shockingly, lots of people don't show up.
Yeah, Keisha?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has to be some checks and balances here.
Yes.
The idea of open borders, I think, is just irresponsible.
Yeah.
You want there to be some checks and balances about when people can come in and under what circumstances they're coming here for.
I would think so.
But I think, it's just important, I think, overall, to make sure that we watch what's going on.
As nothing else I've always said since I love fly fishing, catch and release works well in fly fishing, but it doesn't work well in terms of border security.
Yeah.
And so we catch these people, we release them in the general population, we never see them again. And again, there are estimates on how many people here illegally, and I think those numbers are vastly reduced from the actual number of those individuals. And again, Beto O'Rourke says not only does he not want to build a wall, he wants to tear down the walls we have up there right now. So that does look like open borders to me. We'll see how that plays to the American population. But we need to take a break. We come back, I want to point you to a very good piece by Lathan Watts. I want to hear from some of you in South Carolina, too, about what's happening there between the legislature and the university. All that coming up right after this.
From Thinking Man Films and Fathom Events comes Patterns of Evidence, The Moses Controversy. A new documentary follows investigative filmmaker Timothy Mahoney's faith-affirming journey throughout the Middle East in search of scientific evidence that Moses wrote the first books of the Bible.
The Lord said to Moses, "Write this in a book."
Patterns of Evidence, The Moses Controversy. In theaters March 14th, 16th, and 19th only. More information is available at patternsofevidence.com/Moses.
Is there a lot of free time in your schedule? Probably not. Most of us are on the go all the time, and Point of View is ready to go with you no matter where on the go is. Visit the App Store for your phone or tablet and search for Point of View Radio. Our app lets you listen or watch anytime it's convenient for you. And since we're told to be doers, not just listeners, the app provides a quick way to take action on the issues we're talking about. You can send us a question, find a local radio station, read articles, listen and share Kerby's viewpoints, commentaries. It's a lot of impact in one little free app. Visit the App Store today, right now, and download the Point of View Radio app. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Lathan Watts with us, as well as Keisha Russel. We have at least one call left over from the last hour before we get into some other issues that I think will be of interest to you. So let's head out to Missouri, KNEO. Katie, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, I was telling the young man on the phone that my mother was from Missouri originally and moved to California. When they left here after when the Dust Bowl and all that was going on and things were so rough in the Midwest, and they went to California, they were put behind a fence for about 2 weeks while their whole family, and they lived in a tent because they couldn't get out in the general population. And here they're American citizens, until they could prove that they had no illnesses or anything that was contagious. So to say that where people can just come in here for no reason, even in America, you treat your own American citizens for the good of all. Sometimes you give up something that you might have rights, but for the good of everybody, you may not get to do what you want to do. So I don't understand all this where we just have to let anybody come in the border, anybody that wants, and not do any kind of background checks or health checks. Or even my grandmother came here in 1908 and couldn't get out of Ellis Island until she had a physical check before she got off that island.
That's right.
To come into the United States.
I was going to talk about Ellis Island, so you brought that up. And again, this was the goal that, especially before the age of antibiotics, very quickly you could spread tuberculosis and even things like cholera and all sorts of other issues very, very quickly. And so that was a real concern. And now this idea that we want to not only not build a wall, but at least, as one candidate has now suggested, I even want to tear down the walls we have up there and have open borders. First of all, a country that does not have borders is not a country. So that's issue number one. And I'd never heard that story about that. I'm going to look some of that up because, again, during the Dust Bowl, when people were moving and things like that, I was unaware that if they moved from Missouri to California, even though they were still the United States and they were American citizens, sometimes they were quarantined for a period of time. So I'll look that up.
You can. It was up. They went up to the Marysville, Yuba City area in California, and they were put behind a fence. And my aunt is still alive and tells the story of looking out the fence and wondering why she can't go out and play with the rest of the kids.
Well, you've added some very good conversation to the discussion today. So, Katie, thank you for calling.
Okay. Thank you.
And just a good illustration, if we did that to American citizens, of course, we also put American citizens behind fences after World War II if they were Japanese American. So I don't want to always say that that's the best thing to do, but it just illustrates again that we've got to be a little bit more careful. Individuals coming with certain diseases, but also individuals coming here with certain ideologies, because some of those individuals coming here were suggested maybe criminals, they could be terrorists and others. You got to have a wall, you got to have a door, but you have to have people go through the door, right? And if you don't do some kind of background check, you're going to pay a price for it sooner or later, aren't you?
Absolutely. I mean, like I said, I think, you have to have boundaries. They're important, no matter what it is. And I think we emphasize people's feelings and, offense way too much when really those boundaries are there for a very, very good reason.
Yeah. Fences are good things, aren't they?
Robert Frost thought so. He's my favorite poet. I think good fences make good neighbors.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But a big problem, I think, Kerby, you and I have talked about this before on this issue, is if you start the conversation about immigration reform from what is best for the immigrant, you can go through 100 different scenarios. The final answer will be the same thing. Let them in, because this is the greatest country in the world. There's more opportunity here than anywhere else in the world. So if the question, if the premise of the debate is what is best for the immigrant, the answer will always be the same. They need to come in. We need to let them in. You have to start the argument with what is best for the country.
Yes.
And that goes for any country.
Right.
That's every country's immigration policy should be based on what is best for that country. And that helps you start making decisions as to who comes in, who doesn't. I mean, first criteria, do you want to kill us?
Yes.
No? Okay. Now we can have a conversation.
Yeah.
And you're right. You have to have some sort of barrier down there in order to sort of filter the flow of people to certain points so that you can identify everybody who is coming in. Because that's the biggest problem, is just not knowing who is here and why they came here.
Yeah,
and
it's
why
like you
they
said.
want to be admitted into the country.
Right. And it's like you said, Kerby, earlier, if you're in Ohio, that might not seem like a big deal to you. But if you live in Texas or where I'm from in South Florida, that is a very big deal.
Yeah.
Because you want to know who's going to be right next to you.
And Florida's a good example because Colin talked about that earlier. Again, for our younger listeners, they may not be familiar with the boat people, the boat lift that actually dumped so many people in Cuba into Florida. Now, again, I love the Cubans that I've had a chance to meet in these years in Florida, but I also recognize some of them showing up, they were not exactly model citizens in the United States, right?
That's right. Yeah. And that goes for wherever someone's coming from. There's not model citizens everywhere. And so we want to make sure that the ones that we're allowing to come into America are going to contribute to the country.
And it's not just the borders, too, because about 40% of the individuals that are here illegally overstayed their visas. So some of them came in on a legal visa, overstayed it, never went home. Some of them got off of ships. In Florida, you're not walking across the water. Obviously, you're getting off of a ship there. Or, of course, then we focus a lot of our time and attention on California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. This is something that's new. They're starting to find a whole series of Hispanic refugees coming in from Canada. Now, that's kind of interesting. You've never expected that as well. So it's not just the southern border, it's not just the northern border, it's not just borders, it's all sorts of other factors, but all of those need to be considered. And I haven't put on the list as one of the kind of the mainstream Democratic platform ideas, but at least some are suggesting open borders to that long list I created just a minute ago. And if anything that looks like open borders ends up in the 2020 Democratic platform, again, I just don't think that works well for candidates trying to win a vote in the entire United States.
Not likely. And you also have to talk about, if you're going to talk about immigration and the inflow of illegal immigration, you have to make legal immigration easier.
Yes.
Because there's no incentive to do it the right way.
It's too easy to do it illegally and too hard to do it legally.
Right. Take years, thousands and thousands of dollars for people who want to obey the law to come here and become citizens and become Americans. And it is a perverse disincentive to do that. So at some point in this country, when we're going to start debating this idea, a serious candidate needs to put forth proposals for reforming the legal process of immigration and make that easier and make that the incentive as opposed to what we have right now.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a perfect setup for what we're going to talk about after the break, and that is because they actually have to go through a process of naturalization and learn our history and learn our structure of government. They actually then take a citizenship test and probably know more about the Constitution and more about our government than people that are here who are born here. And so we're going to talk about this. Yeah.
Just kidding.
But interestingly enough, in South Carolina right now, the state legislature and the university there are at odds over whether college students should study the Constitution, the Declaration, and the Federalist Papers. Lathan Watts has written that. We'll come back, talk about that with him and Keisha right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In a previous set of commentaries, I talked about the interview Nick Pitts and I did with Jonathan Haidt on his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Then I saw an essay that quoted his earlier book, The Righteous Mind, where he talked about the conservative advantage. As a liberal, he wrote the book because he was convinced that American liberals do not get the morals and motives of their conservative countrymen. In one study he did with Jesse Graham and Brian Nozick, they tested how well liberals and conservatives could understand each other. They had the people fill out the Moral Foundation's questionnaire. 1/3 of the time they were supposed to fill out the questions normally, answering as themselves. 1/3 of the time they were asked to fill out the questions as they think a typical liberal would respond. And 1/3 of the time they were supposed to fill out the questionnaire the way they believed a typical conservative would respond. The design of the research allowed the researchers to examine the stereotypes that each side had about the other. This also allowed them to see how accurate their answers were compared to people who were liberal and people who were conservative. They concluded that the results were clear and consistent. Moderates and conservatives were most accurate in their predictions, whether they were pretending to be liberals or conservatives. Liberals were the least accurate, especially those who described themselves as very liberal. I might add that this study was published 10 years ago. I think that it's even more likely that the gap in perception by liberals of conservatives has grown even more. Much of what Jonathan Haidt has written about in his recent books illustrates how millennial college students want even more protection from ideas they don't like. They're less likely than before to engage foreign ideas. And this is one example of why we have such polarization in the political arena. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Thinking Man Films, Patterns of Evidence, The Moses Controversy. Did Moses write the first books of the Bible? Patterns of Evidence in theaters March 14th, 16th, and 19th only.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, and especially like to hear from some of you in South Carolina, because it's becoming a bit of an issue. And that is, as I pointed out just a minute ago, the state legislature and the flagship university seem to be at odds about whether or not students should be required to study the Constitution, the Declaration, and the Federalist Papers. This piece by Lathan Watts, What Starts in South Carolina. Sometimes what starts in South Carolina goes elsewhere, doesn't it?
Yeah, a little minor skirmish called the Civil War.
So let's see where this takes us. Go for it.
So you have the state legislature there updated a bill that required the universities in South Carolina to teach the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Federalist Papers. And then you had the University of South Carolina's president, who didn't really like that idea and had previously called it archaic to teach these things. And so the South Carolina legislature just updated the bill. Now, they're still kind of at odds. I haven't heard if we've got listeners in South Carolina who can update me. I don't know what the end result has been worked out there yet. So I'm hoping that South Carolina legislature stands their ground. But the founders intended for the people to be the first guardian of their own liberty.
Right.
And you cannot defend your own rights if you don't know what they are. And so there's an Annenberg survey that I also referenced in the piece that said I think 1 in 3, about a third of the respondents could name the 3 branches of government, and then another third couldn't name a single one. So this level of constitutional ignorance, it has several implications. One of them is if the general population is going to be that ignorant of their own rights, it really magnifies the importance of judicial nominees and people in the judiciary to really strongly adhere to what the Constitution says and protect those rights if the people are not going to know them to protect them themselves. Also suggested maybe Annenberg should have polled the United States Senate on Article 6 of the Constitution, because another problem that comes from people not knowing what their rights are, not knowing what the Constitution says or the Declaration or the Federalist Papers, is that they then are more likely to elect somebody who doesn't know any of those things either, or be more likely to go along with some constitutionally dubious scheme like a court packing plan.
Yeah.
We've seen people in the United States Senate violate the Article 6 prohibition on the religious test for office multiple times in the way they've questioned certain nominees for executive branch and judicial nominations. So we see the effect of this constitutional illiteracy right in front of us right now. And so I think the state of South Carolina was right to renew this bill. And beyond constitutional ignorance, there's a even bigger problem that I allude to in the piece also, and that's knowing things that aren't true. And that has had a huge impact on religious liberty, the work that we do at First Liberty. This concept of separation of church and state that has just made it into the American lexicon that is not present in the Constitution. And knowing things that aren't right is even more dangerous than not knowing things at all. So the reason I wrote the piece was sometimes you can identify a situation that may be sort of specific to that area. Here we're talking about South Carolina, but it's a perfect microcosm for a bigger issue all across the country. And so you can take something that's specific and illustrate a general principle. And that's what I was trying to do. So I hope the state will hold its ground there, because it's very important people understand these documents and their impact on American life.
Yeah, I think it's interesting in our work with religious liberty just how emboldened some of the defendants we face are sometimes, because they just don't realize exactly how wrong they are. And so, for example, there's some times where you'll get a government entity that'll say, well, we didn't, discriminate just against the Christians or just against the Jews. We discriminated against religion equally among everyone. Like, that's okay.
That's okay.
That's still illegal, and
yes.
But they're so passionately wrong about that situation. And I think that happens a lot in the discourse that we have today about like these social issues. A lot of times people can be very loud and wrong.
Yes.
And I think, getting the population to a place where they at least understand the basic rights, basic constitutional principles, and how those principles apply to your daily life will really kind of impact the conversations that we have.
One of the things I've done is next Friday, my commentary, it kind of parallels some of the things that Lathan writes about, because I remind us that many years ago, we were doing an interview with John Whitehead, who's with the Rutherford Institute, and he was complaining back then that very few Americans could name all 5 of their First Amendment rights, which again is the right, first of freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and the right to petition your government. Lots of times they miss, maybe they get 3 out of the 5, sometimes 4 out of the 5. They hardly ever get 5 out of the 5.
Yeah, the grievances one is a tough one.
Yeah, and so I understand that. I got that one.
Yeah.
But the point I'm making is then 5 years later, the same Annenberg Public Policy Center found that 37% of those interviewed could not name any of the 5 rights. So we went from a time where, isn't it amazing that we can't find very many people that can name all 5 rights, to a time where more than a third can't name any of them. Sounds like religion, press, speech. And that is, I think, an illustration that I've posted for next week to illustrate that what you write about here is even worse. It's bad enough that they can't name any one of the branches of government. It's even worse for those of you that are constitutional lawyers that they don't even know there's a thing called freedom of religion.
Right.
Right. Yeah. They get so hung up on the Establishment Clause, and we have to sometimes remind them, hey, we'll keep reading.
Keep reading.
The very next words, the Free Exercise Clause.
Right.
Because it's just as important. And a lot of the case law has gotten out of balance. And so a lot of the things that we're working on are trying to bring balance back to that on the side of the Free Exercise Clause. But Keisha's right. We hear it all the time. Well, this can't be a violation of the First Amendment because we treated all religions equally in our discrimination against them. No, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works.
And you've won the case for us by just stating that, but that's how ignorant people, and these are people who are in positions where they should definitely understand that they cannot do this, but so few people understand these concepts right now.
Before I used to do this, I would speak on college campuses, and I only occasionally was in a law class, but there were lots of times that I was in government classes, pre-law classes, and they would always say, well, what about the separation of church and state? And I always would have one of those pocket constitutions. I would hand them to them and say, see if you can help me find that there. And they're flipping the page. And it was always hilarious. And I said, look, I'm going to save you some time. The words freedom, separation, church, state, those words aren't even in it. Not only is the phrase not in there, any one of those words is not in the Constitution. They go, no. And I said, go look at the First Amendment. That's the closest you're going to find for it. And this was new information for students, many of whom would be pre-law students. So it just shows you the level of ignorance we have right now.
Yeah, I've been in a hearing with one of our attorneys where it was a city board, and they were adamant about making sure they got it on the record. It is not our intent to discriminate against anybody's religious beliefs.
I remember that.
We had to lean into the mic and go, your intent doesn't matter.
Right.
If it
not part of the
discriminates,
standard. Not part of the
If you have
standard.
discriminated against these people, just because you say, well, we didn't intend to discriminate.
I didn't intend to
your
shoot that
intent
person, Your
is
Honor.
irrelevant.
Yes,
Yeah,
I
it
mean, just
is.
think about this intent. I want to take a break, but when we come back, I want to talk about some solutions, because I have one, and that is that more and more of these states are starting to suggest that in order to graduate from high school, you should actually pass the citizenship test. And so, because that's a test that we require of other individuals. We were just talking about immigration a minute ago. So if you come here from Germany, you come here from Canada, you come here from China, you come here from Bangladesh, you come here from South Africa, come here from France, and you want to be an American citizen, you have to read enough and study enough so that you can pass the citizenship test, which, by the way, is a pretty low bar. I found out the other day. If you get 6 out of 10 questions right, you pass. 60%. Well, anyway. But that's one suggestion. But I want to take a break, and I want to hear from some of you. Maybe those of you in South Carolina have been following this case. And I appreciate Lathan bringing it up, because it's not just in South Carolina. I would hope that every state would consider this. And I know, since today we're broadcasting from the state of Texas, Kelly a couple of years ago actually went down to the Texas legislature and testified that it would be good in the history curriculum to have the students read the Constitution and write about it. And so it seems to me that this is very common sense. But apparently for the president of the University of South Carolina, that's just too much, because it's too archaic. So I'd love to get your comments. What about this issue of constitutional illiteracy? And whether you're from South Carolina or not, I'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to read this piece, it is the second article we've posted here today. You might want to hit that share button and maybe put it on your Facebook page and start a conversation, or a Twitter feed, or maybe send it to a teacher. Matter of fact, this week, if you got spring break, maybe some teachers are listening, and maybe they can share what they are doing to teach their students about history and the Constitution. Love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Here's some great news. If you missed the deadline to sign up for health insurance, or more importantly, if you sign up for a plan that you're just not happy with, you still have a choice. It's called MediShare. And MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing program. It's been around for 25 years. They have more than 400,000 members now around the country. And get this, over the years, MediShare members have shared more than $2 billion of each other's medical bills, so they could help share your needs too. And best of all, you could save a lot of money with MediShare. The typical savings for a family is around $500 a month. Your savings could be more or less, but think about what you could do with that extra money every month. So if you think you're stuck with a high-cost health plan that doesn't have much to offer, think again. You can join MediShare anytime, so call them today and check it out. There's no pressure. They're super easy to talk to. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Weekend edition, and Keisha Russel, as well as Lathan Watts here. And again, we are talking about Lathan's article that appeared in Town Hall earlier in the week, but I would encourage you to read it, print it out, maybe pass it on to even teachers you might know or to parents. Let's head first to New Mexico. Roger, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. How you doing today?
I'm good. I'd love to hear your comments.
Well, I'll tell you, I was listening to your piece on the governor of South Carolina refusing to teach the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and the Federalist Papers in colleges. And I guess to an extent I have to agree with the governor in only one aspect. Those classes need to be taught at the high school level so that before these people get old enough to cast a vote, they're aware of the effect their vote has.
I will agree with that.
And again, once people enter college, they basically have a set degree program, and there's classes required for that. So unless that fits into their degree program, that wouldn't necessarily work.
Yeah. And again, if we're going to lower the voting age, because that's another one the Democrats are talking about, lower the voting age to 16.
Oh, God, no.
That was Keisha. I think all of us agree with that. Then you really need to teach it in high school, don't you?
Yeah.
Well, but again, if they were to lower the voting age to 16, and these kids were required to take these classes in a freshman or sophomore year of high school before the age of 16, that would be acceptable. But beyond that, I agree. 16 is too young.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Okay.
but your point's well taken. And, of course, one of the suggestions I've made, and I'm not the only one, because some states now say that they are going to require that in order to get a high school degree, you should be able to pass the citizenship test. I don't think that's such a burdensome requirement. I would love that even before anybody could vote, they would have to take, a test or just have some minimum requirements. But I recognize that's never going to happen because, we had during the Jim Crow period, these requirements were used to prevent African Americans from voting. So I got that that's probably never going to happen. But at least one possible solution, I think, and I'd love to hear about your comments around the table, Keisha and others, that some kind of requirement just to, if indeed you are going to require somebody to pass that test, then that would force teachers who might not necessarily teach that to actually begin to teach to the test, and that would be a good thing, I think.
Well, I think high school should be teaching that, right? I mean, I think that should be a requirement. We should be telling
Obviously,
people
we're not doing it.
what the foundational principles of the country are, what the Constitution means, and what it means to vote, and all of that. And so, if that's not being done, then that's a deficiency in the education system that needs to be fixed. That's not an added burden. That's something that you're already supposed to be doing. So, that requirement, I don't think is too much to ask in a 4-year period.
And Lathan, I know one of the things you left out of this because you had a word limit is the fact that some people might teach it, but they might teach it in an erroneous way or a hostile way. So that's a concern.
It is, yeah. I mean, you could. It doesn't take a real creative imagination to understand that if the university president thinks these documents are archaic and he's still forced to teach them, he may decide that they're going to teach how archaic they are.
That doesn't help.
But even in that scenario, though, at the very least, the students will be required to read them.
They're exposed to it.
And then, hopefully they make up their own minds. And I agree with Roger. Absolutely, there should be a foundation of this sort of knowledge before you even get to a university level. But this just happened to be the fight that was happening in South Carolina, and it was a good example of a bigger principle, and so that's why I wrote the article. But, yeah, absolutely. And please, no, we cannot lower the voting age to 16. And for no other reason than I remember what I was like at 16. I would not trust that guy with a vote.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and I was going to put that down on our long list. It's a growing list every day of what Democrat candidates who want to be the Democratic nominee for president are recommending. And that one I haven't put on the list yet just because I haven't heard too many saying that, but I do hear some saying that. And so we've got a number of other callers from everywhere from California, Georgia, South Carolina. So let's go to Georgia. And Steve, you have the floor. What's your point of view?
Well, I just wanted to say, your program this afternoon was spot on everything y'all are saying. I just wish, like, Betsy DeVos could hear that. I wish you could get in to see her and have her listen to what y'all have said on this show. The man just before me, said that they need to be teaching this in the high school level, and they don't do that in school, I don't think, anymore. And, we need to get it back into the schools, and I imagine you'd have a big fight from the teachers union about it, but that's the goal, is to get these kids to where they don't understand and don't know, and then they can start changing the laws. And there's already rumblings, with all this other mess in the talk, these days. There's already talk that they say the Constitution is not for today, and they're going to do their best to start.
That's right.
To start doing away with the Constitution. And once we lose all that, then this country's gone. And once it's gone, it's not coming back.
Well, again, I hope you'll read Lathan Watts' article, and we've made it available for you. And, of course, it's also in Town Hall. It was March 12th in Town Hall, so you can find it either place. But I would encourage some of you to take that article, hit that share button, post it there, cut and paste it, however you want to do it. And it will start a conversation, because Kelly's not here today, but next time he is, I'm going to have him tell the story about when they went down to the particular presentation. It was before the State Board of Education. It was the history requirements. And one of the requirements was simply that it would require the students to read the First Amendment and write about it. And I cannot tell you the number of people that challenged that. And it's because they recognize that if young people read the First Amendment, they're looking for the words separation, church and state, and they're not finding it there.
Speech.
Yeah.
And it's not there.
It's not there. All of a sudden, they're going to go, whoa. And so it was interesting to see some of the people that were pushing back against this, not just the president of the University of South Carolina, but right there in University of Texas, and some of the leaders from some of the libertarian groups and things like that.
Yeah, and there's always a fight. And I know we're a national audience here, but for your listeners, there's always a big fight about textbooks in Texas.
Oh,
and
sure.
And the reason is because so many textbooks are bought by the state, by the education system in Texas. They basically set the market for for curriculum, because if Texas adopts a certain textbook, they buy so much of it. The ones, the competitors end up not being adopted elsewhere because it ends up being harder to get. Because so there's always a big emphasis on when the State Board of Education here starts looking at new textbooks, you will get lots of interested parties, but just for the sheer volume of books that are bought here. They kind of set the market nationwide. And so a book that's adopted here ends up, in lots of schools around the country, not just in Texas.
Yeah. Marlon Maddox, who, of course, was the original host of this, used to interview Mel and Norma Gabler because they were having such an influence there as well. Another place where textbooks are bought in quite a large frequency and quantity is California. So let's head out there. California, KYCC. Art, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hey, thank you very much for putting me on. Listen, I was just listening to you guys about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and somehow making this a part of the school curriculum. I think that's an awesome idea.
Well, I think we need to figure out some way to hold them accountable, because right now you would think that in most states, including California, and I know in Texas and in South Carolina and other places, it's required. But apparently the students aren't learning it, because we do these surveys and they find that a good third of the Americans could not even come up with, actually it was 2/3 could not name the three branches of government. And what was it, 37% could not name any of the 5 rights protected by the First Amendment.
Which is crazy. I was a teacher, and I'm pretty sure government is 5th grade or something.
You would think that, maybe we should interview the 5th graders and see if they just forget about it by the time they get to the 12th grade.
And that's possible.
But
I can see that. But there needs to be a refresher. I mean, we can't ignore that.
Yeah, we can't. And again,
another thing that survey pointed out was that the respondents who were constitutionally literate, there was a strong correlation between their willingness on other questions to protect the independence of the judiciary. And that's a huge thing. If you're going to have people who don't know what their rights are, who can't name the three branches of government, then the independence of the judiciary becomes even more important, because they're going to be the sole guardians of liberty if people don't know what their rights are.
Mm-hmm.
And that study showed, the more people knew about the Constitution, the more likely they were to be in favor of the independence of the judiciary.
Yes.
It's very important.
Well, we're going to need to take a break, but I can see two of my callers are from South Carolina, so they want to kind of talk about what is unfolding in their state right now. This may be news to them, but again, this is just an illustration of an issue that I think is a national issue. We're focusing a little bit of time and attention on what's happening in South Carolina. We'll come back and take those calls right after this.
Monday, March 4th, was Read Across America Day, spearheaded by the National Education Association. This year, the NEA's sponsoring partner was the Human Rights Campaign, the nation's largest LGBT advocacy organization. The Read Across America tagline is celebrating a nation of diverse readers. Its website features recommended books. Prominent among them is I Am Jazz, written by a biological boy who is now Jazz, a transgender girl. That's the book chosen by an Arlington, Virginia kindergarten teacher, Jane Foster. The Washington Post reports that Human Rights Campaign spokesperson Sarah McBride read I Am Jazz to Mr. Foster's class. I have a girl brain in a boy body, she read. This is called transgender. I was born this way. According to the Post, after her reading, McBride told the children, I'm like Jazz. When I was born, the doctors and my parents, they all thought I was a boy. A little girl asked why, and McBride answered, because society, people around them, told them that was the case. It took me getting a little bit older to be able to say that in my heart and in my mind, I knew I was really a girl. Why this full-court press of the transgender agenda in schools? NEA President Lily Garcia explains that it stems from what she describes as the Trump administration's open hostility to this cause. The president rolled back his predecessor's bathroom mandate, the Obama administration's guidance instructing schools to allow students to use bathrooms that align not necessarily with their biological sex, but with their gender identity. The NEA's Garcia says that now, it is more important than ever that we speak out. We live in a culture that's been blinded and is becoming stupid because influencers have exchanged the truth about God for a lie. Family Research Council's Tony Perkins says these LGBT activists no longer have to hide. Now, they are openly recruiting our kids. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Keisha Russel with us and Lathan Watts, talking about Lathan Watts' piece that is on our website. You can also find it in Town Hall. What starts in South Carolina? Let's go to South Carolina. First of all, Norma, what would you like to add to our conversation?
About the Constitution for South Carolina and schools, I think that they need to go back to teaching it, and because I've been out of school a long time, and sometimes I forget a lot of the stuff, and I need to keep refreshed on it. And I definitely think it would be a wise thing to start back teaching it in the schools with all the other stuff and mess that's going on and being taught. This is something that is very important. I think it needs to be got back into schools and teaching the students.
Make you a good citizen, right? And
Yes,
do you remember being taught the Constitution in high school?
Very vaguely. I think I remember hearing a few little touches here and there, and I know we had a gray book that had red writing on it, was the gateway to South Carolina. And I'm wondering if we had some in that, but I don't really, it's been so long since I've been out of school, and I just don't remember. But I know we had a book like that studied in South Carolina, but I don't remember anything about the Constitution.
Well, if nothing else, listening to Point of View is a good refresher course, right? You know, you got two constitutional lawyers here that can educate you on that. And let's go to someone else from South Carolina, WGAP. Gail, you have the floor now.
Hi. Yeah. Like Norma was saying, it's been a while since I've been out of school, but I remember as a high school student in South Carolina, we didn't necessarily have to learn our state constitution, but we did have to learn the United States Constitution, the preamble, all of that stuff. It was required for us to know it. We had to recite it, from memory. And
that sounds good.
I can't understand this, these schools like, oh, it's out of date. No, it's not, because like I heard someone said earlier, the part that they always say, there's a division between church and state. I'm wanting to be a lawyer. That is nowhere in the Constitution. But because people keep saying it, they want to make it so. It's not so.
Well, and again, one of the lines that you use there is from Ronald Reagan. Again, our political opponents, it's not that they're ignorant, it's just that they know so many things that aren't so. And of course, the classic there is this idea of separation of church and state.
Absolutely. There's another quote in there that's a lot of times attributed to Mark Twain, but it's not really verified. But he said, a man who doesn't read the newspapers is uninformed, and a man who does read the newspapers is misinformed. So, but I use both of those to illustrate the point that there is something worse than ignorance, and that is
misinformation.
Yeah, knowing something that just isn't so. And we see this all the time at First Liberty, as we've talked about here today, as it relates to religious liberty, people that just know things that don't happen to be the case when it comes to the Constitution and the First Amendment.
Well, we will pay attention to what's happened in South Carolina. And those of you in South Carolina, we're not beating up your state. We just thought it was a good news peg to hang a bigger issue and a national issue of constitutional interpretation. But before we run out of time, Keisha, help us understand what's going on right now. The Supreme Court has heard your case, the Bladensburg Cross case. They're probably very familiar with it. We talk about it every single week. But now, between now and when they've heard the oral arguments, they've already voted, essentially, but then they're writing their pieces. But sometimes when they write their pieces, people jump back and forth a little bit. So this is really a matter of prayer, is it not?
Absolutely. And we really want everyone to be praying that the court will overturn the decision of the Fourth Circuit and make sure that cross can stand. And even further, that the justices will see the problem with the Lemon test and decide that test needs to go away.
Well, again, that's one of those very important cases. Another one that we've been following is that they decided not to take Coach Kennedy, but that gets us into this idea of free exercise. But as far as I know, they haven't decided about Aaron and Melissa Klein. So where are we on that?
Well, the court was supposed to, I think, conference on that today, but it's been rescheduled. And so we definitely could use the prayer that the court will take the case and clear up some of the free exercise questions that are going on right now.
Boy, these are two big cases because people, if they look at the First Amendment, see that, first of all, there should not be an establishment of religion, but you have what you was talking about, the Lemon test. You can go into a more detail what that means, but changing that would affect the first part. Then the second part's about the free exercise. That gets into a decision known as the Smith decision. Your First Liberty is at the forefront of really thinking through and maybe even radically changing or returning back to the historical perspective of the First Amendment. Explain, if you might.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So as Keisha alluded to, the argument that we made in the Bladensburg case was not only to protect this specific memorial, but that the way the court has analyzed these cases for the last 30 to 40 years, going by this test known as the Lemon test, comes from a case called Lemon versus Kurtzman, has created this really unmanageable way that lower courts have tried to apply this, and even the Supreme Court itself sometimes applies it and sometimes doesn't, to the point where the Lemon test has gotten to be cause, exactly, and it has caused more confusion than it has resolved. And it's gotten to the point where just about every time it is applied, the subject matter in question is ruled unconstitutional.
Right.
So if it's a test that nothing can pass, there's obviously a flaw with the test. And it has also created this sort of hostility towards any sort of public display, whether that's a person praying in public or a religious image being seen in public, this sort of hostility to religion in the public square altogether. And that is clearly not what was intended by the First Amendment. So what we argued in that case was for the court to return to the text of the First Amendment and establish a better way of evaluating these cases going forward that's more focused on whether or not someone's being coerced into worshiping or compelled to support some state-approved religion. And then with Aaron and Melissa Klein's case, we're asking the court to reconsider the Smith decision, which basically regarding free exercise had really gutted free exercise as a legal claim altogether. I mean, you just almost don't bring them anymore because of that decision. And that decision really lowered the bar of scrutiny that the courts apply to challenges, and that's why a lot of these cases, including the Kleins, and Coach Kennedy, were brought as free speech cases,
free
religious speech.
Yeah.
So if we're able to get these two wins, first of all, as Keisha said, pray for the court as they're considering Bladensburg. If we get a new direction and abandon the Lemon test, that's going to have a really historic impact on the country. And then if the court takes the Klein's case and does what we're asking them to do in that case and reforms or overturns Smith, these would be the two biggest decisions on religious liberty in my lifetime.
Decades.
For sure.
Absolutely. It would be monumental.
It would change it from being a footnote to a whole section of the history, the legal history. So you're hearing about it on Point of View, and that's one of the reasons to go to firstliberty.org. And if you aren't already receiving their newsletter, that'll give you an encouragement to pray. They have kind of revamped their news material and their website, so I would encourage you to visit it, even if you haven't visited it recently. And you're going to find some great resources you can listen to and see some of the videos. There are all sorts of cases and lots of updates. So, again, it's just been great to have you both here today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Always enjoy it.
And let me just mention that next week we are going to get into a number of issues. Chad Hennings is going to be in here. We're going to be talking about ministry to men. Jerry Tuma will be talking about us later in the week when we get into some of the economic issues. And, of course, we will next week. I think we have Jeremy Dice here and Penna Dexter. We have Chelsea with me on Wednesday. They have a millennial roundtable, but Chelsea will be the only millennial. I'm leading it because our other millennials are gone. So, again, I hope you'll join us every single day here at Point of View. If you would like to find some of these articles, including the one we're mentioning right here by Lathan Watts, it's all available on the website pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday right here on Point of View.
Question: do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about Medishare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With Medishare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with Medishare. And they actually like Medishare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of Medishare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less and they like it more. No wonder Medishare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.